Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 6th chapter of Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. And this epistle to the Corinthians, like any other, was written in a situational context. And the church at Corinth could be what we call a problem church. They had a lot of internal deficiencies that Paul had to attend to from a distance. So the New Testament introduces the epistle as an altogether new means of teaching inspired doctrines, and necessity was the mother of this invention because the new faith had spread far and wide beyond instant communication culture. They had to communicate by letter, so Paul couldn't be everywhere at once, but he did at least have a foot in the door in many of the assemblies he either personally founded or was connected to by at least spirit, if nothing else. And so he does have a concern for them in this particular problem church, is what I called it earlier. You read in the first chapter that there was a division of factionalism in them. So certain congregants gathered around a faction around Paul, another Apollos, another of Peter. And in the third chapter, he explains that him and Apollos were watering and seeding the same field, and it was Elohim who gave the increase. And we also learn in the 5th chapter that they were prone to spiritual pride. Now, they were a gifted assembly. They had no shortage of gifts, but their individual giftedness was not contributing to the collective good, and so they were a selfish people. The same spirit of factionalism that was rampant in them was a species of selfishness, because they used their gifts to showboat rather than to edify the collective. And it seems almost unthinkable, at least to myself, to be visited by the Spirit but not be humbled by it. And that is the only explanation of how one can wield the power of the Spirit in the absence of his guidance, and it's to no one's benefit. And in the 6th chapter, we read of two species of internal deficiencies, as we can call them. One was the practice of settling their legal disputes in the pagan and Gentile court. As we read, he reminds them of their privileged station of judging the fallen angels and the humanity, so why were they bringing themselves to court? And the other deals with sexual sin. Now, Corinth was the site of the temple of Artemis, Greek fertility deity. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and orgies and other sins of sexual licentiousness were very much embedded in a lot of the non-Hebrew religion. There was a lot of immoral practices which actually went into their idolatry, and he tells them to shun and abstain. So in the Corinthians' defense, they were surrounded by a greater degree of temptation. Corinth was the commercial capital of Greece at this time. They were in the Roman province of Achaia, and Athens would have eclipsed by the time of Alexander, and henceforth it became Alexandria. But that's another story. We're just going to open with the opening verse, which reads, "Should any of you, holding a matter against another, go to be judged before the unrighteous and not before the saints?" So this is framed and phrased like a question, and it's a rhetorical one at that. The obvious answer is no, they should not be doing this, yet they are doing it because the same spirit of selfishness which instills their pride causes them to be vengeful and litigious towards their neighbor in their court, and that was giving a compromised witness to the city, because the city could see them partake in a lot of the sins which were accepted in there, and that also destroyed their witness. "Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world is judged by you, and you unworthy to judge the smallest matter," so the saints, those are the ones who are worthy to be called such, will one day judge the world, and it is our privilege and prerogative for remaining faithful. And he's questioning by what right do they have to claim this exalted judgment when they are so petty-minded in their judgmentalism that they are getting all worked up over petty and personal and selfish concerns. Do you not know that we shall judge angels? How much more matters of this life? So the angels would have been the fallen angels. These are the third, which joined Lucifer in his rebellion. And and because we partake in the judgment of such superior creatures, at least to us, the weight of that responsibility, how can it be entrusted to one who is overly concerned and overly litigious against his brother, his Christian brother of all people? If then you truly have judgments of this life, do you appoint them as judges who are least esteemed by the assembly? I say to you, your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise one among you, not even one who shall be able to judge between his brothers? So for all their judgmentalisms, they were not reaching efficient and definitive verdicts because no member among them was qualified to exercise judgment over any others. They were all sinners, and it's dangerous ground for a sinner to call the sin. So even we have this blessed expectation and hope to partake in the judgment, we must not be judgmentally minded if we expect to inherit such a lofty position. And there's really, it's an oversimplification that there is to be no judgment at all in the Christian life, because Paul was effectively judging them for judgment, but he carried the moral authority which could get the church back in order, and that's what it's all about in a church management and government. You can try and do it without judgment. You can go by the platitude, judge ye not, but it ain't going to work in the long run. Save yourself the trouble right now. But brother against brother goes to be judged, and that before unbelievers. So not only was this unnatural division into the flock, which is like into a family, we are all our brothers and sisters in faith. We, theoretically at least, all of us share the same adopted station as children of Elohim that makes us brothers in our common Father. And what treatment of this was to do such a thing to one's equal and one's brother, and that before the pagan population to whom they were charged to witness, to draw them out of darkness, and they could only see that they themselves were in the darkness. So who were they to call out for this exalted calling that Christians are called to embody? Do you not know that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of Elohim? Do not be deceived, neither those who whore, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals. So this is the list of people who are unqualified to inherit the kingdom of Elohim. The first of foremost is the unrighteous, those who are inclined to iniquity in general. And then the list narrows down to those who whore, Artemis, the temple of Artemis, and the culture of prostitution would have been around them at all times. And the temptation was to indulge, but as we read later, as Paul comments more extensively on sexual sin, it's something to avoid, not indulge. Nor idolaters. Artemis herself was an idol. She was an erroneous deity who was likened to images and the traditional representations of polytheistic pagan idolatry. And adulterers, those who followed her, were the Greeks were what we would call a sexually liberated species. But as we in the Christian church know, that sexual liberation leads to slavery, so they were enslaved by their lusts. The Greek people were, the ancients at least, nor effeminate, nor homosexual. So this is ultimately a controversy which has raised in the wake of the modern world of homosexuality. And my personal stance is that we should not exclude them from our flocks, because every sinner deserves a second chance. And a lot of people think you have to come to the cross, change yourself before you come to the cross. We should be leading them to come to the cross as they are and let the cross change them, but we should not outright exclude those who are effeminate or homosexual, because theoretically unlimited redemptive potential exists in each individual. Nor thieves, nor greedy of gain, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers shall inherit the kingdom of Elohim. So he adds on to the list thieves, that's an obvious sin, taking what doesn't belong to you, stealing, robbing. It's a crime as well as a sin in any society. Greedy of gain, that's to have the mind of mammon and to be carnally oriented towards the worldly pursuits, filthy lucre, etc. Drunkards, now abstinence from alcohol is nowhere commanded in the Bible, but drunkenness is always and only condemned as a sin. And revilers, those who drink, are prone to revile. That means have wild parties, loose living, indecent exposure, things of that sort. Swindlers, that's synonymous with thief, a more specific type of thief, but you can figure that out for yourself. All of them are declared unfit and unqualified to inherit our exalted inheritance of eternal life. So there is definite do's and don'ts for inheriting eternal life, and we'd be wise to heed these warnings. If any one of these sins you're guilty of, it's time to get rid of them. And he ultimately instructs you how to, Paul does, how to flee from your lusts. And such were some of you, but you were washed, but you were made clean. You were justified in the name of the Master Yahshua, and by the Spirit of our Elohim. So he's saying he was aware of many of these congregants' backgrounds. They were born and raised in pagan practices and pagan culture. So this was literally all around them. This was the cultural circumstance in which they found themselves, for better or worse. They were making it worse. Paul was determined to make it for the better, so he recognized that many men he had personally instructed and nurtured and developed would have been once guilty of sins that they are now ashamed of, and so there's redemptive potential in all of us. It's never too late. Even the wicked King Manasseh, I did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston's 2 Chronicles 33. It wasn't too late for him, so it's never too late for us. All is permitted me, but not all do profit. All is permitted me, but I shall not be under authority of any. So this hypothetical person is speaking the language of license, where anything that they can do, they are allowed to do. There's no limits, there's no restrictions, nothing is forbidden. All is accepted, tolerated, and condoned. And the illusion of succumbing to such a free-spirited individualism is that one thinks one is liberated, but they succumb to the tyranny of self, as so many selfish people do. So they are, in fact, under authority, a darker, more demonic authority than anything external. Food's for the stomach, and the stomach's for food, but Elohim shall destroy both it and them. And the body is not for whoring, but for the master, and the master for the body. So he's acknowledging a scientific statement that food is designed to go into the stomach, and the stomach is designed to ingest and absorb and digest food, but they're going to be, one day they're going to be useless. So we learn that we will not, in fact, eat during the resurrection period. So that's a detail. We won't need to eat anyway. We'll still probably be allowed to eat. And the body is not our own. It belongs to the body, which is the continuation of the body of Elohim in the flesh, who visited us in human form to give us the clearest expression and witness of who the Father is and what divinity can do for us. So we owe our bodies to him, and we are to daily die in self-sacrifices. And Yahweh, who raised up the Master, shall also raise us up through his power. So the first fruit of the resurrection is the one who paves the way and makes it possible for us unworthy creatures to share in his resurrection. So he was resurrected because he was born, lived, and died without sin, and through the appropriation of his alien righteousness, we who are saved can claim that and declare that and partake in his eternality and live in immortal and eternal heaven. We are not never eternal creatures, as because we have definitive starting points and moments in time when we came into existence. He pre-existed everything, but we do share in his eternality in some sense that he gives it to us immortally. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Messiah? Shall I then take the members of Messiah and make them members of a whore? Let it not be. So one who belongs to the body of the Messiah, their body no longer belongs to them, so why would they make it belong to a whore after everything Paul had just said about the need to abstain from sexual sin, and paying for sex is whoring, and that would have been just a common practice. No one thought too much about it. It was just the way of life in ancient Greece, but the Christians began to raise the bar on the sexual liberation of the Greco-Roman cultures. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a whore is one body? For he says, the two shall become one flesh. So Paul is bringing it all the way back to Genesis. That's what we read of the Edenic marriage between Adam and Eve, when the sacrament of the family was instituted, divinely so, and it was so that we become joined, we become more than the sums of our parts. We cease being two people and become one in that perfect union. And so why would one waste that with moving around from whore to whore rather than remaining one with the special someone? And he who is joined to the master is one spirit. Flee whoring. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits whoring sins against his own body. Now, in all honesty, I'm going to come clean with a confession. I do not know everything that there is to know about the Bible, and one of the sins I struggle to make sense out of are the sexual ones, except for adultery, because that's an obvious breach of faithfulness. But fornication and even homosexuality, the argument can be made that we're only hurting ourselves. But just because we're not hurting anyone else does not mean that we are violating and hurting and grieving the spirit of the one who gave it. So I actually just made more sense of what was previous point of confusion. So this verse really tied it together, and that was completely unexpected. All of these are extemporaneous comments, and so that was revelation in the midst, we can call it. For you were bought with a price. Therefore esteem Elohim in your body and in your spirit, which are of Elohim. So the price was the Son's crucifixion at the cross, and Yahweh the Father sent his own Son at tremendous value. This was at great personal price to him, and is something we can never pay, and he paid all our debts. So he lived the life we couldn't live and died the death we should have died, and we cannot take that lightly. That demands a responsible response to treat it worthily and dignified and with value. Do not belittle its value, which is beyond measure, and we owe it to not only abstain from the sins of the flesh, but the sins of the spirit. It was the sins of the spirit which was prompting them to take their brother to court to sue them, and in so doing present a watered-down testimony to the pagan unbelievers, which they were called to do. So that brings it all the way back from the 20th verse all the way to the beginning, and we're going to close on that note. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned till next time. Bye-bye.